Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone by J.K. Rowling. Chapter 1, Part 1. Chapter 1. The Boy Who Lived. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of Number 4 Private Drive were proud to say that they were perfectly normal. Thank you very much. They were the last people you expect to be involved in anything strange or mysterious, because they just didn't hold to such nonsense. Mr. Dursley was the director of a firm called Grunnings, which made drills. He was a big, beefy man with hardly any neck, although he did have a very large mustache. Mrs. Dursley was thin and blonde and had nearly twice the usual amount of neck, which came in very useful as she spent so much of her time craning over garden fences, spying on her neighbors. The Dursleys had a small son called Dudley, and in their opinion, there were no finer boy anywhere. The Dursleys had anything they wanted, but they also had a secret, and their greatest fear was that somebody would discover it. They didn't think they could bear it if anyone found about the Potters. Mrs. Potter was Mrs. Dursley's sister, but they hadn't met for several years. In fact, Mrs. Dursley pretended she didn't have a sister, because her sister and a good-for-nothing husband was as un-Dursley as it could possibly to be. The Dursleys shuddered to think what the neighbors would say if the Potters arrived in the street. The Dursleys knew that the Potters had a small son, too, but they never even seen him. This boy was another good reason for keeping the Potters away. They didn't want Dudley messing with a child like that. When Mr. and Mrs. Dursley woke up on the dull gray Tuesday, our story starts. There was nothing about the cloudy sky outside to suggest that strange and mysterious things would soon be happening all over the country. Mr. Weasley hummed as he picked out his most boring type of work, and Mrs. Dursley gossiped happily as she rustled a screaming Dudley into his high chair. None of them noticed a large tawny owl flutter past the window. At 8:30, Mr. Dursley picked up his briefcase, pecked Mrs. Dursley on the cheek, and tried to kiss Dudley goodbye, but missed, because Dudley was now having a tantrum and throwing his cereal at the walls. "Little tyke," chuckled Mr. Dursley as he left the house. He got into his car and back out the Number 4 drive. It was on the corner of the street that he noticed the first sign of something peculiar. A cat reading a map. For a second, Mr. Dursley didn't realize what he had seen. Then he jerked his head around to look again. There was a cat standing on corner of Private Drive, but there wasn't a map in sight. What could it have been thinking of? It must have been a trick of the light. Mr. Dursley blinked and stared at the cat. It stared back. As Mr. Dursley drove around the corner and up to the road, he watched the cat in its mirror. Now he was reading the signs that said Private Drive. No, looking at the sign. Cats couldn't read maps or signs. Mr. Dursley gave himself a little shake and put the cat out of his mind. As he drove towards the town, he thought of nothing except for a large order of drills he was hoping to get that day. But on the edge of the town, drills were driven out of his mind by something else. As he sat in the usual morning traffic jam, he couldn't help noticing that there seemed to be a lot of strangely dressed people about, people in cloaks. Mr. Dursley couldn't bear people who dressed in funny clothes, the get-ups he saw in young people. He supposed this was some stupid new fashion. He drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, and his eyes fell on a huddle of these weirdos standing quite close by. They were whispering excitedly together. Mr. Dursley was enraged to see that a couple of them weren't young at all. Why, that man had to be older than he was, and wearing an emerald green cloak. The nerve of him! But then it struck Mr. Dursley that this was probably some silly stunt. These people were obviously collecting for something. Yes, that would be it. The traffic moved on, and a few minutes later, Mr. Dursley arrived in the Grunnings parking lot, his mind back on drills. Mr. Dursley always sat to the back on the window, in his office on the 9th floor. If he hadn't, he might have found it harder to concentrate on drills that morning. He didn't see the owl stooping past the broad daylight, though people in the down street did. They pointed and gazed mouth open as owl after owl spread overhead. Most of them has never seen an owl even at nighttime. Mr. Darcy, however, had a perfectly normal owl-free morning. He yelled at 5 different people. He made several important telephone calls and shouted a bit more. He was in a very good mood until lunchtime, when he thought he'd stretch his legs and walk across the road to buy himself a bun from the bakery. He'd forgotten all about the people in cloaks until he passed a group of them next to the baker's. He eyed them angrily as he passed. He didn't know why, but they made him uneasy. This bunch were whispering excitedly too, and he couldn't see a single collecting tin. It was on his way back past them, clutching a large stone in the back, that he caught a few words of what they were saying. The Potters, that's right. That's what I heard. Yes, their son Harry. Mr. Darcy stopped dead. Fear flooded him. He looked back at the whispers as if he wanted to say something to them, but thought better of it. He dashed back across the road, hurried up to his office, snapped at his security not to disturb him, seized his telephone, and had almost finished his dialing his home number when he changed his mind. He put the receiver back down and stroked his mustache, thinking, no, he was being stupid. Potters weren't such an unusual name. He was sure there were lots of people called Potter who had a son called Harry. Come to think of it, he wasn't even sure his nephew was called Harry. He'd never seen the boy. It might have been Harvey or Harold. There was no point in any worrying Mrs. Darcy. She always got so upset at any mention of her sister. He didn't blame her, if he'd had a sister like that. But all the same, those people in cloaks. He found it a lot harder to concentrate on drills that afternoon, when he left the building at 5 o'clock. He was still so worried that he walked in straight into someone just outside the door. Sorry, he grunted, as a tiny old man stumbled and almost fell. It was a few seconds before Mr. Darcy realized the man was wearing a violet coat. He didn't seem upset at almost being knocked to the ground. On the contrary, his face split into a wild smile, and he said in a squeaky voice that made passengers stare by, "Don't be worried, my dear sir, for nothing could upset me today. Rejoice, for you know who had gone at last. Even muggles like yourself should be celebrating this happy, happy day." And the old man hugged Mr. Darcy around the middle and walked off. Mr. Darcy stood rooted to the spot. He had been hugged by a complete stranger. He also thought he had been called a muggle, whatever that was. He was rattled. He hurried to his car and set off for home, hoping he was imagining things which he had never approved before, because he didn't approve of imagination. As he pulled into the driveway of number 4, the first thing he saw, and it didn't improve his mood, was the tabby cat he spotted that morning. It was now sitting on his garden wall. He was sure it was the same one. It had the markings around its eyes. "Shoo!" said Mr. Darcy loudly. The cat didn't move. It just gave him a stern look. Was this normal cat behavior? Mr. Darcy wondered. Trying to pull himself together, he let himself into the house. He was so determined not to mention anything to his wife. Mr. Darcy had a nice normal day. She told him over at dinner all about Mrs. Next's problems with her daughter and how Dudley had learned a new word. Won't. Mr. Darcy tried to act normally. When Dudley had put to bed, he went into the living room in time to catch the last report on the evening news. And finally, bird watchers everywhere had been reported that the nation's owls have been behaving very unusually today. Although owls normally hunt at night, they are hardly ever seen at daylight. There have been hundreds of sightings of these birds, flying to every direction since sunrise. Experts are unable to explain why the owls have suddenly changed their sleeping pattern. The newscaster allowed himself a grin. Most mysterious, and now over to Jim McGruffin with the weather. Going to be any more showers of loud owls tonight, Jim? Well, Ted, said the weatherman, I don't know about that, but it's not only the owls that have been behaving oddly today. These are as part as Kent, Yorkshire, and Dan E. have been phoning in to tell me that instead of rain I've promised yesterday, they had a downpour of shooting stars. Perhaps people have been celebrating bonfire night early. It's not until next week, folks, but I can't promise a wet night tonight. Mr. Dursley sat frozen in his armchair. Shooting stars all over Britain? Owl flying by day-night? People in cloaks all over the place, and a whisper about the Potters. Mrs. Dursley came into the living room carrying 2 cups of tea. It was no good. He had to say something to her. He cleared his throat nervously. Petunia, dear, have you heard from your sister lately, have you? As he had expected, Mrs. Dursley looked shocked and angry. After all, they normally pretended she didn't have a sister. No, she said sharply. Why? Funny stuff on the news, Mr. Dursley mumbled. Owls shooting stars, and there were a lot of funny-looking people in town today. So? Snapped Mrs. Dursley. Well, I just thought maybe it was something to do with, her crowd. Mrs. Dursley sipped her tea through her pursed lips. Mrs. Dursley wondered whether she dared to tell her he heard the name Potter. He decided he didn't care. Instead, he said as casually as he could, "Their son? He'd be about Ellie's age right now, wouldn't he?" "I suppose so," said Mrs. Dursley stiffly. "What's his name again? Howard, isn't it? Harry, nasty, common name, if you ask me." "Oh, yes," said Mr. Dursley, his heart sinking horribly. "Yes, I quite agree." He didn't say another word on the subject as he went upstairs to bed. While Mrs. Dursley was in the bathroom, Mr. Dursley crept to the bedroom window and peered down into the front yard garden. The cat was still there. He was staring down at Private Drive as though it was waiting for something. Was he imagining things? Could all this have anything to do with the Potters? If it did, if it got out the way they were related to a pair of... Well, he didn't think he could bear it. The Dursleys got into the bed. Mrs. Dursley fell asleep quickly, but Mr. Dursley lay awake, turning it all over in his mind. His last comforting thought before he fell asleep was that even the Potters were involved. There was no reason for them to come near him and Mrs. Dursley. The Potters knew very well that he and Petunia thought about them and their kind. He didn't see how he and Petunia could get mixed up in anything that might be going on. He yawned and turned over. It couldn't affect them. How very wrong he was. Mr. Dursley might have been drifting to an uneasy sleep, but the cat on the wall outside was showing no sign of sleepiness. It was sitting as still as a statue, his eyes fixed unblinkingly on the far corner of Private Drive. It didn't so much as quiver when a car's door slammed on the next street, or when 2 owls swooped overhead. In fact, it was nearly midnight before the cat moved at all. A man appeared on the corner. The cat that had been watching appeared so suddenly and silently you have thought he just popped out of the ground. The cat's tails twitched and its eyes narrowed. Nothing like this man had been seen on Private Drive. He was thin, tall, and very old, judging by the silver hair in his beard, which were long enough to tuck into a belt. He was wearing long robes, a purple cloak that swept to the ground, and high-heeled buckled boots. His eyes were bright, and sparkling behind half-moon spectacles as his nose was very long and crooked, as though it might have been broken at least twice. This man's name was Albus Dumbledore. Guys, thank you for listening, and we'll be back with part 2.